Good morning, everyone. How's everybody doing? Love it. I told Paul I'm gonna give us maybe another minute or so in case people trickle in. And then I have to actually pay attention in case people need to be admitted from the waiting room, like I did a second ago. So, thanks everybody for joining us for the CFCP summer conference. This is our second annual, I hope, summer conference. We had a small conference on Nico Kolodny's book manuscripts early last summer, and we're hoping to actually have conferences in person where people can come out and get a chance to talk outside of sessions. But in the meantime, hopefully we're keeping it a little light commitment, not too much time in front of your Zoom screen over the next couple of days. And I want to thank everybody who's coming out to participate, speakers and participants. Paul, I'm not big on big introductions, but I'm excited for your paper. The format we're going to follow is speakers are going to speak for 30-ish minutes. I told them I would cut them off at 35 if they keep going. So don't get too anxious if it gets to 31 or 32 minutes, everybody. But and then we'll have plenty of time for open discussion from everybody. I'll take a cue at that time. But let's just kick it off, Paul. Tell us what you want to talk about.
Yeah, sounds good. So I actually, if you could enable screen sharing, I can put up some PowerPoint slides that I'll talk through.
Yes, you should now be enabled.
Okay, let me try that. Yep, here we go. Okay, everybody see that? It's good. Okay, so sorry, I'm just gonna make sure I can see the people in Zoom. All right, here we go. So I'm going to be talking about group fanaticism and the way in which it connects to an emotion that philosophers sometimes describe as ressentiment, which is just the French word for resentment. But some philosophers influenced by Nietzsche and some other thinkers use the term ressentiment to pick out sort of a special case of resentment that has distinctive features that aren't shared by every episode of resentment. So I'm going to be talking about what that is exactly and how that connects to fanaticism at the group level. Okay, so first thing to do, though, is to talk about what I even mean by fanaticism, right? Because it's not transparent what that term means or whether it means anything at all. I think when we typically think about fanaticism, or when you see that term like in newspaper articles, magazine articles, stuff like that, there are a couple of things that are often associated with fanaticism. One thing that is very commonly associated with fanaticism is a certain kind of religious extremism. So on the left-hand side there's the picture of the ISIS fighter. Another thing that's typically associated with fanaticism in popular discourse are violent nationalist groups that are intolerant and so forth. We also see particular individuals who are sometimes labeled fanatical. So, you know, you could give any number of examples of different people who might fit this bill, but here are two. Breivik is a Norwegian terrorist. He killed 77 people in Oslo and a small island called Utøya. And distributed a very long, rambling manifesto shortly before doing that. He's a potential example, often thought of as fanatical. Another example is the guy at the bottom of the screen there, Devon Arthurs, who's actually quite interesting because he sort of flipped from one kind of fanatical group to another kind of fanatical group. So he was originally a member of a neo-Nazi group and was involved with his roommates in building bombs and potentially plotting to use them. But then through internet chat sites, he got involved in talking to some proponents of radical Islam and actually converts ultimately to radical Islam, and then decides he needs to kill his roommates because they're neo-Nazis who disparage Allah. So a very interesting flip from one sort of extremist or fanatical ideology to another. Other examples, you can all think of your favorite political examples of groups that might be associated with fanaticism. But I think the question that all of these things raise is, what is it exactly that we mean when we label either an individual or a group fanatical? So what do we mean by that? Now, one possibility is that we don't really mean anything at all, that this is just a sort of term of abuse, that maybe we just call people fanatical when we see somebody who's passionately committed to some value or some ideal or some political cause that we regard as problematic, especially when it's problematic for either being violent or intolerant or both. So that's one possibility, that these individuals and these groups really have nothing in common other than that. A second possibility, and this is the one that I think is right, is that there actually is some sort of philosophically interesting type that we can single out there. So there actually is something with philosophical import that is sometimes being picked out by these descriptions of groups or individuals as fanatical. Now, this used to actually be a very common view. So if you go back a couple hundred years into Enlightenment era philosophy, people like Voltaire, Locke, Hume, Shaftesbury, Kant, and others thought there was something called fanaticism, and they thought it was important to offer a philosophical analysis of that phenomenon. Each of these figures obviously has different accounts of what that phenomenon is, but there is a kind of shared agreement amongst many of them that fanaticism involves a very resolute form of commitment, a kind of perseverance in the attempt to realize some end or bring about some goal that is somehow detached from standard forms of rational reflection. So that's the sort of common core. And what many of these philosophers want to do is provide an analysis of what exactly that amounts to and why it's problematic and so forth. Now, I think that those accounts are really interesting, but I also think they're problematic. I can talk more in discussion about why they're problematic if people want me to. But basically, in some of my other work, I've sort of critiqued this shared Enlightenment account and offered a sort of alternative to it that I think preserves what's good about it and get sort of some of the bad features. Basically, the problem with the Enlightenment account, as I see it, is that it's just too broad. It does capture many of the things that we think of as fanaticism, but it also captures a lot of other stuff besides. And it fails to do one of the things that these philosophers are trying to do, namely to pick out some condition that's supposed to bear an interesting causal connection to violent intolerance. So for various reasons, I think that these philosophers fail to give a good account. So I've defended another account of fanaticism. I just want to mention it really briefly because this will be relevant in my discussion of group fanaticism. So one thing that I think is going on, and this is something that the Enlightenment era philosophers who I just mentioned would agree with, although they wouldn't use this term to describe it, is that a lot of cases of fanaticism involve what empirical psychologists today call sacred values. So sacred values, it's a technical term. It's a sort of research program that's a few decades old in empirical psychology. A lot of psychologists define this term in slightly different ways, sometimes in incompatible ways. But I think that when you look carefully at that literature and try to figure out what these people are trying to get at, what phenomenon they're interested in, what they're trying to argue is that some, but not all, of our values have the following three features. The first feature is the easiest to understand. It's just that these values are lexically prioritized over other values. So, for many of my values, like I value coffee, I value ice cream, no problems treating them as fungible, trading one against the other and so forth. Other values don't operate in that way. Other values I take to be inviolable. I take it to be wrong to trade them against other values, right? So maybe justice is like that. I'll trade ice cream for coffee, but I won't trade ice cream for justice. Okay, that's the first one. The second, more interesting, stranger, is that they're not just viewed as things that it's impermissible to trade. They're also viewed as things that it's impermissible to think about trading. So it's perceived as wrong to not just to trade these values or treat them as exchangeable, but even to contemplate hypothetical scenarios in which one might trade them. to give you a quick example, this is a little complicated to spell out precisely, but here's a quick example. Obviously, it would be wrong if I contemplate killing my grandfather to collect an inheritance, right? If I actually do that, that would be wrong. But it's also really bad to think about that as a serious possibility, right? Like if I weigh up the pros and cons of killing my grandfather to get some money, something's gone wrong. If I don't do it, that's good. But if I really think about it seriously and only some sort of calculation of expected utilities or whatever sways me from doing it, that's already a kind of failure, right? Something like that is what the psychologists are trying to pick out with this notion of incontestability. It needs more explanation. I can talk more about it if people want me to. Here's the third one, which also requires a lot of explanation to state precisely, but a lot of what's going on here is that psychologists want to map out this one type of value that's unaffected by justificatory reasoning in the same way or to the same extent that other values are. There are a lot of complications in trying to render this precise. The core idea is that some of my values are very responsive to critical reflection about their justification, in the sense that were I to think that they're unjustified, were I think that there are some problems with the grounds to which I formerly took them to be justified, I would attenuate my commitment to them. Other values seem not to operate in that way. Okay, again, that would need some spelling out, but this is what psychologists typically associate with sacred values. And this is basically what a lot of the Enlightenment era philosophers who I talked about earlier associate with fanaticism as well. Not just this, but this is one of the features, having sacred values that they associate with it. Okay, that's the first thing. That alone doesn't get you to fanaticism, though, I don't think. Sorry, that something got screwed up on my slides. Okay, I think there are these three other conditions, which the numbering has gone astray here. They should have been labeled 2 through 4 rather than 1 through 3. So apologies for that. But what I try to argue is that you need to couple sacred values with a couple of other conditions to get the state that we typically think of as fanaticism, because the state that we typically think of as fanaticism involves not just this potential problem with the way that values are held. It also involves something about the agent's psychology. That's what I'm trying to cash out here. So I try to argue that there's a form of rigidity that's present in fanaticism that's not present in ordinary agents, or not present to the same extent in ordinary agents. I described it in terms of the agent being sort of rigidly committed to a particular conception of his or her own identity. That's what this condition that's labeled 1 on this slide is supposed to pick out. Typically, I can envision departures even from the things I hold to be most important without that threatening my sense of my own identity. I think there's a sense in which the fanatic cannot do so. I also try to articulate this state that I call fragility of the value, where a value's status as sacred is taken to be threatened if it is not universally regarded as sacred. So I think that's another phenomenon that's present in fanaticism. And the third, which is easier to understand, is just this form of group identity, where the fanatic, the individual fanatic, is identified with some group where the group is defined by shared commitment to the sacred value. So I think you see that in the nationalist movements, in the terrorists we might be inclined to regard as fanatics and so forth. Again, that was really quick, and all of those conditions would require more explanation to be convincing. But this is basically the account that I try to defend. And I try to defend it because I think that if 1 through 4 are present to high degrees, they actually do dispose the individual toward the kind of violent intolerance that we would typically associate with fanaticism. That's not a necessary connection, obviously. Any number of things, either at the individual or the social level, might prevent or inhibit these conditions from leading to the kind of violent intolerance that we typically associate with fanaticism. But nonetheless, I try to argue that there is a connection there. Okay, so that really quickly is what I think an account of individual fanaticism should look like. I can talk more about that in discussion if people would like. Suppose you like that account, or suppose you have some other account of individual fanaticism. The question that we'd want to ask is whether that account of fanaticism at the individual level can be extended to the group level. How might that work? So one thing that we need to think about if we're to characterize not just fanatical individuals, but fanatical groups, is precisely what kind of problem with these groups we're trying to articulate when we label them fanatical, right? I mean, there are all types of problematic groups. Let me give you a couple of examples. There are intolerant groups. There are groups that try to suppress or overrule or eliminate opposed views. That's bad. That's a problem with groups. There are extremist groups. Those might be, you could define this in different ways, but one way of defining it is that a group would be extremist if it either endorses values or methods toward values that we would regard as extreme. There are cultish groups. There are groups that place unquestioned authority in some single figure and don't have a way of critiquing or distancing themselves from that figure. I think fanatical groups, they often have a lot of those features, right? So definitely a lot of the groups that we label fanatical are intolerant. A lot of them have extreme values. I don't think they all do, but a lot of them do. Some of them are cultish. But I think that there is something interesting about the groups that we're inclined to label fanatical that's a little bit different from each of those potentially problematic conditions with groups. And the thing that I want to articulate here is that I think we can think of a group as fanatical when it encourages the emergence of individual fanaticism in its members. So in other words, in virtue of being a member of this group, you're made more likely to manifest the features that we associate with individual fanaticism. I think that's what looks distinctive of these groups and differentiates them from some of the others. Let me give you some examples. I'll just give two quick examples. So Atomwaffen, some of these quotes I'm going to give are rather disturbing, but I think it's important to get the phenomenon into view. So this is a white supremacist group. So this is a quote aimed at recruitment that was on one of their websites in 2015. So one of the leaders posts that we're a very fanatical ideological band of comrades who do both activism and militant training. He talks about how there's weapons training and so forth. He talks about how, as he puts it, keyboard warriorism, that's not what they do. What they do is actually get out there in the real world. He says, joining us means serious dedication, not only to the Atomwaffen division and its members, but to the goal of ultimate uncompromising victory, where that's taken to mean the establishment of some kind of white nationalist state. He goes on, with this means only those willing to get out on the streets, in the woods, or wherever we may be in the world and work together in the physical realm. He goes on like that. So one thing that's going on here is that he's attempting to recruit individuals, not just to sit around and post on the internet, but to actually get out there and engage in these violent, intolerant activities that we're all familiar with. So it's explicitly presented as encouraging its members to participate in violent activities in the real world. Okay, here's another, actually, I'll give you another example later. So here's the idea that I think is promising when thinking about these groups. I think that we can think of a group as fanatical when it promotes individual fanaticism in its members. One reason we might want to adopt a view like that is because presumably part of what we're trying to do when we label a group fanatical is try to pick out some distinctive problem with that group. So for a group to be fanatical, that's different than for the group just to be violent. That's different than for it just to be intolerant. There's something special, something distinctive, I think, about the fanatical groups that we're trying to single out there. And this is actually a really old claim about fanaticism. So this used to be expressed in kind of imagistic or metaphorical ways. This is an old tract from Martin Luther from 1525 in very old German that says something like, against the murdering, thieving hordes of peasants. But one thing that people like Martin Luther and other individuals do when they're talking about fanaticism is they worry that it spreads. So you can see Voltaire, for example, in his dictionary entry on fanaticism, says that fanaticism is like smallpox. Smallpox being paradigmatic of this contagious disease that rapidly spreads when you come into contact with it. Now, of course, fanaticism is not literally like that. It's not like if I'm walking down the sidewalk and I bump into a fanatic, I turn into one. right? But I think that what the philosophers are trying to capture with this talk of contagion, which is very widespread in the early modern period, is that there's something about groups, about fanatical groups, that actually does spread individual fanaticism. And I think what it is that there's a certain kind of group, the kind of group that we're inclined to label fanatical, that actually promotes the emergence of individual fanaticism. Okay, so how might that happen? So, if you're with me so far, I've been saying that, maybe there's this distinctive problem with certain groups that we can pick out by labeling them fanatical. What is that problem going to be? The problem is going to be that those groups encourage the emergence of individual fanatics. Okay, so if that's right, how might that work? That's the next question. Now, there's a lot of empirical and sociological work on this kind of question. A lot of it goes under the heading of radicalization studies, and it's a absolutely massive literature. But just to put the shortest of summaries of that literature on this single slide, obviously glossing over a lot of complications. Here are some of the main contenders when people are trying to explain radicalization. Radicalization usually means becoming a terrorist. Or becoming an extremist. That's different than becoming a fanatic, potentially at least. But I think some of the points are going to carry over. So I want to just gesture really quickly at this literature. Here's the most obvious reason why you might become radicalized. It might be instrumentally rational, given your values. So, hold constant where your values or your goals come from and whether they're justified. And suppose that in light of those values and other beliefs that you have, what's instrumentally rational for you to do is, for example, to engage in terrorist activities. So, if you look at a lot of the statements from bin Laden and other al-Qaeda leaders, they're pretty clearly in this mode. Some of the values that are being posited or the goals that are being posited are ones that we'd obviously want to critique or object to. But if you hold those goals constant, a lot of the particular activities, the terrorist activities that are being undertaken, are instrumentally rational in light of those assumptions. So one thing that some people in the radicalization literature talk about is that, these people engaging in terrorist activities, they're instrumentally rational. Those activities do make sense in light of their goals. So the thing to do is address the goals or the values or the other assumptions. Another somewhat different branch of the literature is sometimes called significance quest theory. And it's basically the idea that people seek goals or values or communities that provide them with a sense of meaning or purpose in their life, and that certain radical groups do this. Another sort of research study or body of research studies says that we should appeal really to the peer groups, the groups of people that people interact with. And that fanatical groups or terrorist groups and so on tend to provide a kind of welcoming environment for individuals who are otherwise socially isolated. There's also a body of literature in what's called identity theory, where people who have conflicted identities or who sort of can't make sense of their different commitments or values, or who feel threatened in various ways, that promotes the search for coherent or non-conflicted identities, and that those are offered in a certain way by terrorist or fanatical groups. Now, I think there's a lot that's interesting in this literature, but I also think there's a pretty big problem with the way that a lot of these studies are conducted. And I'm not unique in raising this objection by any means, but I mean, the basic problem, which may have already occurred to you, is that these are just reasons for joining groups in general. I mean, this might give you a reason to join a terrorist group if you want some significant quest, but it also might give you a reason to join a group of, I don't know, video gamers or play sports or whatever. So there's nothing distinctive about terrorist groups that's singled out here. Now, people have responses to that. We can talk about whether the extremist groups fulfill these things to a greater degree or in a simpler way and so forth. So there can be back and forth on this point. But I'm tempted to go in a sort of different direction. And the different direction is this. I think that there actually is a sort of distinctive mechanism that we often find in fanatical groups that looks like it's being employed, whether consciously or just tacitly, in a way that attracts members. And a basic tendency of a lot of these groups that we're tempted to label fanatical is that they foster an emotion, the one I mentioned at the outset that Nietzsche describes as ressentiment. And I think that when an agent exhibits ressentiment, those features that I was associating with individual fanaticism are actually very likely to emerge. So if you could get a kind of narrative that promotes ressentiment, you would thereby be promoting individual fanaticism. Okay, that raises some questions. What's ressentiment? That's the most obvious one, right? So here's that. So resentment. You can define resentment, ordinary resentment, in different ways. Here's one fairly standard definition, that resentment is indignation resulting from the belief that you or some group that you're a part of has been wronged, right? Ressentiment is supposed to differ from ordinary resentment in a couple of different ways. It has these features. Let me just put these up quickly because I'm conscious of getting a little short on time. So ressentiment is supposed to differ, and I should say that like this stuff I'm about to say, this is the way, so Nietzsche introduces this term ressentiment, and then some people who are influenced by him, like Max Scheler and some phenomenologists and others, sort of take up this distinction and work with it. The thing that I'm about to explain here is more like Max Scheler's view than Nietzsche's view, but the details don't, those exegetical details aren't really important. What's important is just that this is a special type of resentment. So ressentiment is first supposed to be fixated in a way that resentment needn't be. So the person experiencing ressentiment focuses either on some individual person or more often on some group, and views that person or group as wholly responsible for the wrong, for the perceived wrong. The second thing is that ressentiment is supposed to be something that tends to linger and grow in intensity. So resentment isn't necessarily like that. Resentment might be easily discharged. Like, I don't know, somebody shoves me in a subway, but then they apologize. You know, for a second, I'm indignant because I feel like I've been wronged, but then it just goes away when they apologize. Ressentiment isn't supposed to be like that. It doesn't seek that kind of alleviation. It doesn't dispose you, rather, to seek that kind of alleviation. It is supposed to fester and grow in a certain way, where, to put this roughly, you're more likely to take steps toward the maintenance of ressentiment than you are to take steps toward the extinguishing of ressentiment. Okay. The second thing is that partly for that reason, partly because it persists, the scope of the perceived wrong tends to grow. So I might initially focus just on some individual wrong, but in the way that ressentiment is typically analyzed, the person begins to see more and more of what's inadequate about his life, more and more of what he feels cut off from or deprived of, as a result of this person or group that he's fixated upon. Moreover, one thing that's supposed to be essential about ressentiment, as it's typically analyzed, is a kind of impotence. So you don't feel capable of rectifying this perceived wrong on your own. You see it as beyond your individual power to rectify. But you do have some sense of a way in which, in some perhaps imaginary or perhaps in some greatly deferred way, you could extinguish this wrong, you could correct this wrong. So ressentiment, it shares some of the features of resentment, but it's either a special case of resentment or it's resentment plus some other features, depending on how you want to think about it. Okay, I can say more about each of these conditions. But notice that if we have ressentiment, it encourages those conditions that I was labeling 2 through 4 on the earlier slide. So 2 through 4 was fragility of the self, where your identity is sort of rigidly fixated on some particular conception. Condition 3 was that you also view the value that you take to be sacred as demanding universal acceptance in order for it to retain that status. And condition 4 was the group orientation condition, that your identity is bound up with membership in some group. Insofar as ressentiment is all-encompassing and fixated, it tends to encourage you to think about your values, your ideals, your commitments in that sort of way. One part of this is going to be that your identity is seen as fundamentally damaged or wounded or aggrieved by some other, by some group, right? That's not seen, so it's not like when somebody shoves you in the subway and then that's it, it's like a singular occurrence that happens, it's in the past now. This is something that persists. It's something that provides a central and continuous focal point for the way that you understand yourself and your sort of evaluative and social condition. The object that's fixated upon is typically defined as bad or evil or wronging you or threatening or disparaging you, depending on the nature of the wrong. I can talk more about that. The crucial point is that your identity becomes bound up with opposition to that thing. You define yourself in terms of opposition to it, right? So the white nationalist group that I've pictured here is a pretty clear example of that sort of thing, right? Like a lot of the white nationalist narratives focus on this sense of aggrievedness and attribute that to the putatively diminished status of white individuals as a result of non-white individuals occupying privileged positions, right? So this can be imaginary, I should emphasize. It doesn't need to be tracking actual conditions. So insofar as your identity is bound up with conceptualizing things in this way, it will become increasingly difficult to revalue it. And I think this is where we get the rigidity condition that I mentioned earlier. Breaking out of it requires not just local adjustments here and there, but a rethinking of your fundamental orientations. So suppose that's right, and sorry I'm going over this so quickly. The next question is just like, how would a group do that? So suppose it's true that if you can get somebody to experience ressentiment, you've gone a long way toward making them a fanatic. How would I get somebody to experience ressentiment? Think about the structure of typical fanatical narratives. Many of the narratives that promoted, for example, by white nationalist groups or by ISIS and groups like this, they emphasize the way in which the individual lacks control of his fate due to some external force, but they offer some often quite fanciful, in the sense that it's not possible to really imagine this taking place, this quite fanciful scenario in which that will be rectified. I'll give you two really quick examples. So this is an example of an Al-Qaeda commander. I won't have time to read through all this, I guess, but let me highlight a few key phrases in this speech that he gives to other members of Al-Qaeda and potential recruits. He says that the path of jihad is the path which pleases the Almighty God and achieves his obedience. It's the way to purge the ranks of Muslims and the mean to uphold the banner of monotheism, exterminate infidelity and desecration. But look at that middle paragraph in particular. Jihad for the sake of God is the refuge of the weak, the shelter of the oppressed, the peace of mind of the faithful and hermits, the place of safety for the frightened and petrified, the way to lift the humiliation from the suppressed and petrified, and restrained. The corruption will not be eliminated from this world except with jihad and fright. And he goes on to talk about all the wrongs that are being perpetrated against members of what he regards as his group and so forth. So that's one example. Here's another example from Identity Europa, violent white nationalist group. So Nathan DeVigo is one of the people who famously assaulted this woman in Berkeley. Anyway, he says that America was founded by white people. It was founded for white people. America was not founded to be a multiracial, multicultural society. The founders were well aware of the importance that identity played in the makeup of the nation and how fundamental it was and so forth. And then he goes on to give all these examples. And again, notice how divorced from reality these things can be, but he gives all these examples of the way in which he thinks that white Americans are being persecuted in the same way that Native Americans were in the 19th century. So he says, for example, that even though horrible things happen to indigenous people, at least they got some land set aside for themselves. Whereas he thinks that white individuals are suffering from analogous forms of persecution and oppression and don't even get that. So it's a ridiculous claim, obviously, but you can see that the structure is there, that the white individuals are being aggrieved by this other group, that's responsible for all the failings and so forth. Okay, so notice that these fanatical narratives, of which I've just given you two examples, I could give a lot more if I had more time, but fanatical narratives typically define a group in terms of some common characteristic. namely opposition to those who they see as wronging them, together with a path toward recovery. The narratives provide a purpose or a meaning or a goal. It provides them with something to strive toward. And the narrative's exculpatory. It treats everything that's wrong with the group's life, like with white individuals and so forth. Everything bad about what they're experiencing is due to these things that are being forced on them by the outgroup. You also see that in the Al-Qaeda speech, right? The narrative is fixated on some outgroup as responsible for all of those failings, as responsible for all of the negative features in one's life. And notice that those are precisely the features that are present in ressentiment. That ressentiment is the thing that differs from ordinary resentment in that it involves this fixation on a particular individual or group. It involves the persistence of that fixation. It tends to grow in scope, not focused on a singular wrong, but instead focused increasingly on a broader and broader set of failings and inadequacies and perceived wrongs. It couples a sense of powerlessness with some kind of deferred compensation that will be attained in some way through the group as a whole. So it maps on pretty nicely, I think. So let me just tie all this together. So I said that we might want to adopt something like this account of individual fanaticism, right? And then I was saying over the past couple of minutes that what seems to me like a promising view of group fanaticism is that a group qualifies as fanatical if it promotes individual fanaticism amongst its members. Now, you could fill that in different ways, depending on whether or not you like this particular account of individual fanaticism. If you've got some other one, you can just plug it in and still accept the general claim. But if you accept this one, the question becomes, how would a group promote conditions 1 through 4? I mean, 1's easy to have sacred, you just like say this value is sacred, right? And try to convince people that it is. So that's easy, but what about 2 through 4? Those look harder. The proposed answer is that we could promulgate these narratives that encourage the emergence of ressentiment. And I gave you some examples of how that goes, because ressentiment, once you get it going, tends to promote conditions 2 through 4. So to the extent that you can get these narratives that encourage group-based ressentiment, you would get the encouragement of individual fanaticism. So that's sort of the story. Obviously, each of those things requires a lot of explanation. I've got this book coming out that talks about a lot of this stuff in much more depth. It's more generally on like what it is to be devoted to an ideal, but it talks about pathologies of ideals. I take this to be one of them. So if you want like the whole story, you can look at that when it comes out in December, I think. But yeah, that's my story. I'm happy to talk more about it in the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. So let's open up the discussion. If you got let's use the Zoom hand feature. And I'll go ahead with Marcel first. And then just pop up your hand if you got a question. Go ahead, Marcel.
Thank you. Thanks so much for the talk. It's really so fascinating. And I just wanted to ask you about the connection between fanaticism, your account, and how it might make someone predisposed to violence. So that's one part of it, right? And I was thinking about, what do you think about the connection between not just a predisposition to violence, but to self-sacrifice? So I'm thinking about, early Christians who would not deny that Christ was the Messiah, even if that implied that they would be sort of burned or sent to the lions. And it seems to me that they do meet some of the, or most, if not all of the individual features of the account of fanaticism, but rather than a predisposition to violence, it seemed to sort of, go into this idea of sort of self-sacrifice.
Domestic violence is a kind of violence, a kind that has been historically ignored, and all kinds of violence deserve our care and attention. But when the scope of domestic violence is extended to refer beyond the more familiar and gruesome cases perpetrated by married partners, the question becomes a little bit more challenging to answer. So for instance, we might feel a less urgent need to respond when someone slaps their partner's hand as they reach for another cookie at the dessert table, even though it could be called violence between intimate partners. The challenge of identifying why we should care is made more difficult when domestic violence and domestic abuse are used interchangeably, right? Ostensibly extending the scope of reference even further to include phenomenon like emotional abuse. So while domestic violence has historically been neglected, charges of domestic violence now carry great weight, or at the very least, greater lip service. Being seen as a perpetrator of domestic violence is stigmatized, and an accusation is typically seen as a grave condemnation. If the scope of the term is extended, then we need to make sure that the condemnation matches the gravity of the act or the acts. If there's a mismatch between our use of the term and what genuinely deserves moral condemnation, we should either correctly limit the scope of the term or work to change public perception of the gravity of acts identified as instances of domestic violence or domestic abuse. Okay, so this talk is an attempt to make legible harms that give us reason to care about and reproach cases of domestic violence that are missed when we rely on traditional understandings of what makes for a good life. In light of this discussion, I argue that the reasons we have for caring about domestic violence give us reason to harshly condemn acts that may otherwise appear to be relatively trivial, such as slapping a partner's hand or telling them that they don't need that third cookie from the dessert table. However, the reasons we have for caring about domestic violence may actually preclude cases we would ordinarily understand to fall under its scope. In such cases, we should exercise caution in triggering that condemnatory function of the term domestic violence. Okay, so an overview of what I will be doing. First, I'll be giving an overview of historical responses to and understandings of domestic violence. So these understandings, I argue, reflect a largely hedonistic conception of what makes for a good life, focusing on the pain and suffering caused by physical and emotional abuse. So second, I look at how the loss of freedom, where that's understood from within a Republican tradition, or autonomy, have been understood as a harm of domestic violence distinct from the pain it causes, whether that's emotional or physical pain. In response to this, I argue that most intimate relationships are actually characterized by a kind of dependency and vulnerability, and that this dependency and vulnerability can actually be valuable in healthy relationships. Nevertheless, by corrupting a relationship of dependency and vulnerability, perpetrators often undermine the abilities of victims to pursue serious interests that cannot be understood in hedonistic terms. More specifically, I argue that perpetrators often undermine the abilities of victims to cultivate or maintain meaningful projects or relationships. Given the central importance of these meaningful projects or relationships for living a good life, namely in how they give us reasons to go on living, this feature of domestic violence gives us reason to invoke the harsh condemnation of the term, even if the loss of autonomy in itself is not reproachable, and even absent clear evidence of physical violence. Okay, let's see here. Ordinarily, I would drink my tea at the section pauses, but I think it's too hot, so don't want to have a spit take on camera. Okay, so with domestic violence understood as a kind of violence, just as deserving of condemnation as violence in other contexts, it's easy to make sense of several harms from within a traditional hedonistic perspective. So it looks like we've got a room full of philosophers, but just in case, in crude terms, our lives go well according to a hedonistic perspective, insofar as they are pleasurable, and our lives go poorly insofar as they are painful. While there is reasonable disagreement over whether the use of physical violence in self-defense, or perhaps even in retaliation, is ever morally justifiable, the straightforward cases, and these might be few and far between, where there's one perpetrator wielding control over another through the use of physical violence, this gives us clear reasons for reproach, and harsh condemnation generally receives a good deal of public support. So, One of the most prominent social scientific understandings of domestic violence that informed and still informs legal practice to this day is Lenoir Walker's theory of the cycle of violence. So in this cycle, Walker understands as characteristic of domestic violence, there's first what she calls a tension building phase, quote, characterized by minor physical abuse as well as verbal and emotional abuse. This leads to the more severe physical assault of the acute battering incident. So this is usually what our attention is centered on, the acute battering incident. Then the relationship goes through a honeymoon phase where the batterer apologizes or begs for forgiveness, brings the victim flowers, and promises to be better. Finally, the cycle starts over as the batterer inevitably becomes abusive once again. So this gives us reason perhaps to think that domestic violence is worthy of condemnation for the aggregation of the harms involved throughout the cycle rather than one acute battering incident on its own. So while the legal system is still influenced by this theory of the cycle of violence, theory has since been subject to several social scientific challenges. Some, for instance, take issue with the emphasis on physical violence in Walker's theory and legal practice. So when the theory is invoked, typically it's invoked so that lawyers can say, look, there's evidence that there might be an acute battering incident because there's this pattern, right? There's this cycle of violence, right? So we can assume, even if we only have evidence for one, that there are several. But the challenge is that in fact, these other moments within the cycle are deserving of our attention and condemnation. Given testimony from victims that emotional abuse can be just as bad or worse than physical abuse, the argument goes, we ought to be paying more attention to emotional abuse, perhaps decentering the acute battering incident as the primary subject of our concern. So once again, we can make sense of these harms largely in hedonistic terms because emotional harms are painful or they involve some kind of suffering. We generally think that it's morally impermissible to cause someone to feel shame, inadequacy, guilt, and so on, simply for our own benefit. While these emotions can be meaningful and serve important functions in our lives, some instances of guilt can serve as a moral corrective. They can also be inappropriate, they can be painful, and in some cases more painful than the physical violence. And they're not to be wielded against someone simply to serve our own, sometimes unjustifiable ends. In fact, we can even say from a purely hedonistic perspective that serious harms can occur in the absence of physical violence when the perpetrator uses emotional abuse to control the victim. So there's a lot to say here about when any given instance should be considered an instance of emotional abuse, but my goal today is not to simply adjudicate competing claims. Rather, I want to demonstrate how reproach could be justifiable in circumstances where an individual suffers from emotional harms. And given certain conditions, such as the foreseeability of those harms, the severity, and the reasons an agent has for causing such harms, it can be appropriate to reproach someone for emotionally or psychologically harming someone else. These reasons for reproach are not simply reducible to the physical harms that more commonly give rise to reproach. So they're not just, a reference point for saying there's likely an acute battering incident. And so just as domestic violence has functioned to condemn physical violence that has often been overlooked, so too could the term be used to condemn emotional and psychological harms that are overlooked and yet warrant a correction in public perception. I just want to add a footnote here that it could warrant the extension of the scope, but there might be other practical considerations that weigh on our evaluation. And so I don't mean to say here we should extend it, just that we have at least one reason to extend the scope of the term. Okay, so now I'm going to test if my tea is cool enough for me to take a sip. All right, we're golden. All right, so far I've discussed emotional harms as additional reasons for reproach beyond physical violence, but there are also defenders of what is known as the coercive control account of domestic violence and philosophical discussions of domestic violence that have stressed how the loss of control itself should be understood as a harm rather than a harm insofar as it leads to pain or loss of pleasure. I referenced my reactive dog later in the paper. You might have heard her just there. That's the dog I'm referencing later in the paper. Okay, let's see here. So developing Walker's initial insight that violence often takes place in a larger pattern, sociologist Evan Stark identifies coercive control as the core of what we ordinarily understand to be domestic violence. And in fact, places like Scotland, Northern Ireland, and some places in the US have worked off of Stark's framework to criminalize what they call coercive control. Okay, so as opposed to this incident-centered approach that understands domestic violence in terms of the individual instances of battery, Stark argues that we should instead focus on how those individual instances work together to coercively control the victim and undermine their freedom. Someone who uses, as he says, a calculus of physical and psychological harms to determine the harms of domestic violence will therefore miss the harm done to a victim when they lose control over their own life. So much like Marilyn Frye's analogy of the birdcage to describe oppression, counting up the individual instances of assault or insult to assess the harm done will ignore this totalizing effect on the victim's control over their own life. In line with these shifts in social scientific understandings and policy movements, Victor Tadros argues that the domestic context and systematic nature of violence in the domestic context undermines a victim's freedom, right? So once we have this loss of self-governance that's centered as a harm of domestic violence. To defend this position, Tadros relies on Pettit's conception of freedom as non-domination. So that conception says that to be dominated, one must be secure from arbitrary interference. I can say more in the Q&A if that's of interest. And Tadros's account shares much in common with other philosophical treatments, how few and far between they are, of domestic violence that center freedom and autonomy. So as described by Marilee Bramer, the perpetrator of domestic violence actively works to subvert the autonomy and agency of his partner. They make it the case that she no longer chooses her own ends and works toward them. Marilyn Friedman describes domestic violence as diminishing the victim's autonomy. So they differ slightly in how they understand this harm, but there is this focus on the loss of the ability to govern oneself. While autonomy and security against arbitrary interference may be something that an individual values, several feminist and disability scholars have argued that autonomy and such security are not necessarily things that are or should always be valued. At the very least, autonomy and security from arbitrary interference might not be valued above and beyond all else, such that our efforts to secure happy, healthy relationships should prioritize that all parties are fully autonomous and secured from any arbitrary interference from their friends and family. Instead, we might be concerned to secure individuals against particular kinds of interference or compromises to their autonomy because of how security and autonomy relate to their other values and interests. In that case, what we have good reason to reproach could be more limited than all instances of domination in this Republican sense or compromises of autonomy. So I have two examples here. So first, we have a child, Gabe, who is under the control of their parent, Noah. So clearly we want Gabe to be physically secure from any kind of violence, right? That's why we have child protective services. We want to reduce particular kinds of arbitrary control that parents have over their children. However, we may not be too concerned if Gabe is not entirely secure from arbitrary control and its exercise. So we want Gabe to be protected from abuse and negligence, but it wouldn't seem terribly concerning if Noah is not always forced to track Gabe's best interests when, say, choosing their meals. So generally, parents and guardians should make decisions about what meals their children have with their children's best interest in mind. But allowing other values to take precedence when they conflict can be entirely reasonable. if Noah faces many work deadlines in a given week and opts to give Gabe Lunchables instead of a well-balanced meal, Noah's behaviors should not invite concern or reproach. Hopefully that's reassuring to some parents in the audience. So Gabe's interest in having well-balanced meals is important, but it's not sufficiently important to always be Noah's priority, right? At least when it comes to selecting meals for their child. Okay, so that's a case where we have an individual who is not fully autonomous, right? To think through the importance of autonomy for individuals assumed to be more or less autonomous, consider a case of two partners, Joy and Kate. So suppose that Kate comes to the relationship with substantial savings. Her parents were wealthy, and she has been able to secure full-time employment in adulthood. While Joy works full-time, she doesn't have much in savings. She has had to pay down a considerable amount of student debt without familial support. Because of Kate's financial security, Kate and Joy decide to purchase a home together. However, to preserve their relative financial independence, Kate takes on the financial responsibilities for the home purchase. Her name is the only one on the title. While this allows both of them to retain some degree of financial independence, Kate can reclaim that investment she made, and Joy is able to save some money because she doesn't have to pay rent anymore. Kate will nevertheless have some degree of control over Joy, so long as she retains full ownership of the home. She could, for instance, sell the home, even if the choice to sell the home did not track Joy's interest and Joy would be forced to move. While the condition of financial inequality is undesirable, it would seem inappropriate to reproach Kate for her relative privilege and power, or for someone else to intervene in their relationship to correct the inequality, at least outside of some larger scale socialist movement. Okay, so by focusing on how domestic violence compromises the autonomy of victims, or how it is characterized by domination in this Republican sense to explain its harms, I want to argue that we are risking vilifying dependency more generally. So for many, I grant the loss of autonomy itself is experienced as a harm. But dependency can also be beautiful. Seeing the world through the eyes of one's loved ones and having one's perception of the world fundamentally altered through that effort can be positively transformative. And here my dog comes in. So I do not regret my visceral response to a truck passing by. I tense up and I feel like something's coming to hurt me. Instead, it's a reminder of how my life and my perception have changed by welcoming my moderately reactive dog into it. Relying on others to have certain needs met or to have others rely on you can also bring purpose to one's life. Protecting everyone from relations of dependency would not only require a totalitarian police state and a radical revision of how we understand childhood and dependency, but it could also deprive us of the beauty that can be found in dependency and vulnerability. Let me just check my time here. Okay, so it might be objected here that domestic violence is not characterized by a loss of autonomy, freedom, or control. It is characterized by a total loss of autonomy, freedom, or control, including the loss of a victim's abilities to autonomously reflect on their interests. Understanding domestic violence as characterized by a total loss of autonomy can help us make sense of how dependency can be valuable while still understanding the loss of autonomy in context of domestic violence as a serious harm for all victims. So I think there's something right to this objection. For most of us, some degree of control over our lives is valued for its own sake, right? And the harm is felt as a serious harm. My aim here, though, is not to discount the harm of a loss of autonomy and freedom for individuals who have interests in autonomy and freedom for their own sake. So especially for children whose future capacities for autonomy are seriously compromised by controlling behaviors, setting back their interest in autonomy should be considered a grave harm. However, I still want to resist the temptation to neatly explain the devastation of domestic violence in terms of a loss of autonomy and control. Part of what makes domestic violence so devastating, I argue, is that the corruption of dependency and vulnerability can more generally compromise our serious interest in life. These interests can neither be made sense of in exclusively hedonistic terms, nor by exclusive reference to a loss of autonomy. And yet, our ability to live good lives is dependent on their satisfaction. By entering into relationships of dependency and vulnerability, these interests become vulnerable and can be used as weapons for establishing control. And so this is where the domestic context leaves us vulnerable to particular harms. Okay, time for some tea again. Okay, so by looking at the corruption of vulnerability and dependency, my aim is to expand our attention from how domestic violence undermines what we might call our welfare interests to include what we might call our ulterior interests. So ulterior interests are our ultimate goals and aspirations, such as our goals to write great philosophy, or maybe to visit every hot spring in California, or to combat injustice, or to be a good parent or friend. So these are goals that we strive for as ends in themselves. By contrast, our welfare interests are interests in the means to our more ultimate goals. For instance, our welfare interests might consist of interests in intellectual acuity, physical well-being, willpower, and emotional competency. So here again, I have two examples, but we're talking about the cookie I mentioned in the very beginning. So in one case, let's suppose there's a partner, Evan, and a partner, Max. So Evan is a diabetic who has been working very hard to lower their blood sugar. Max has been enlisted by Evan to help him reach that goal so that Evan can pursue their more ultimate goals that are dependent on retaining abilities that would be compromised by worsening diabetes, such as loss of sight, loss of mobility, and so on. While Evan may have a welfare interest in being free from physical pain, by slapping Evan's hand, Max may be helping Evan pursue their more ultimate goals. Of course, there could be other means of preventing Evan from compromising their more ultimate goals. But if Evan wanted the kind of Pavlovian corrective that the hand slap provided, then there might be nothing to reproach in Max's behavior, despite the fact that Max slapped Evan's hand. Okay, so in quite a different example, we can suppose that there are two partners, Rebecca and Blake. So Blake is working to recover from a restrictive eating disorder and has been making progress. However, Rebecca is concerned that by reaching for that third cookie, Blake could be setting themselves up for failure. Blake could, after all, then feel so guilty for eating 3 cookies that they choose not to eat the next day. If Blake has not solicited Rebecca's help, the same kind of Pavlovian corrective could strengthen Blake's association of food with shame. So even if Rebecca's intentions were pure, an outsider who could see the effect of Rebecca's actions on Blake may have good reason to reproach Rebecca for their actions, or at the very least to intervene by telling Rebecca how their actions were in fact affecting Blake. So in other contexts, Blake might steel themselves against this kind of strategic manipulation. So they might put up psychic barriers against the boss, for instance, who tries to make them feel guilty about reaching for the third cookie. Or they might not let their relationship with food be known to their boss so that the boss could not weaponize those vulnerabilities. But in intimate relationships, we allow ourselves to become vulnerable to another, and our vulnerabilities become known through close and regular interaction. When your every vulnerability is known to another, they can make use of those vulnerabilities to affect your work, your relationships, your leisure, your thoughts, and your dreams. While this intimate knowledge can deeply bond us to others, it also leaves our ulterior interests more vulnerable to attack. So these examples illustrate why it is important to distinguish between welfare and ulterior interests, and why in evaluating the harmfulness of any given action, we need to look at the affected party's whole network or portfolio of interests. In many cases, it will be obvious that an individual's ultimate goals will be thwarted by the impairment of their welfare interests. But in other cases, like the case of Max and Evan, the impairment of one's immediate welfare interests may less obviously connect with the thwarting of one's ultimate goals, if they do at all. Yet modest setbacks to one's welfare interests can pose serious threats to one's ultimate goals, as in the case of Blake and Rebecca. These are precisely the cases where the question, why should we care about domestic violence, may non-rhetorically be asked. So, as I've argued, let me check my time once again. As I've argued, the ways in which domestic violence can undermine the ultimate goals of the victim should give us reason to care, even in circumstances where the victim's welfare interests are not obviously or seriously jeopardized, and do not give us reasons to care, or apologies, it gives us reasons not to care in some circumstances where the victim's welfare interests are compromised. I am concerned in particular with how the corruption of vulnerability and dependency can lead to a loss of meaning or purpose in one's life by undermining a victim's pursuit of their most important ulterior interests. Our ulterior interests often define who we are and give our lives purpose, and from which we may be alienated in context of domestic violence. For instance, social work researchers document cases of women being forced to transgress their religious beliefs by perpetrators. When living by one's religious beliefs is one of your guiding commitments in life, being forced to transgress those beliefs can alienate a victim from one of their most important values. There are many different ways a perpetrator may interfere with a victim's pursuit of their ulterior interests. And as noted, different people have a wide range of ulterior interests. Some of those interests, such as one's interest in living by one's own religious commitments, are well recognized as serious interests. However, these interests come in degrees of intensity and are not universally shared. While some people highly value their religious commitments, many do not have religious commitments at all. So despite the variation in cases, I argue that not only does domestic violence have the possibility of compromising our ulterior interests, but in fact that domestic violence should be understood as characteristically involving the undermining of a victim's most serious ulterior interests, namely those that give them reason to go on living. This is because perpetrators often alienate victims from their friends and their family. While there may be variation in the seriousness of our ulterior interests and what ulterior interests are compromised by domestic violence, our interests in our relationships with friends and families are interests that motivationally root us, most of us, if not all of us, to the world. They give us reasons to get up in the morning and live another day, even when our other interests fail us. By focusing on the alienation of victims from their social lives, I hope to motivate the seriousness of harms a victim may face and the deservingness of reproach for many cases of domestic violence. Okay, so last section, let me take another sip. Great, okay, so to illustrate how domestic violence can lead to a loss of reasons to go on living, it's useful to shift from the language of welfare and ulterior interests to a neighboring distinction, namely the distinction between conditional and categorical desires. While some ulterior interests may be more or less important than others, like the desire to see every hot spring in California, and my desire to see my work published. My hope is that the language of categorical and conditional desires can help us articulate why some of our ulterior interests are more important than others. Okay, so I won't just leave you hanging by introducing new terms, I'll explain them. So as described by Bernard Williams, contingent desires are premised on the assumption of our continued existence. Because I'm already committed to go on living, for example, I have a desire to eat healthily. Eating salads doesn't propel me forward in life. It doesn't give me reasons to go on living. My desire for eating salads is contingent on my commitment to go on living and does not by itself sustain my interest in life. Categorical desires, by contrast, are not premised on our continued existence. Instead, they give us reasons for living. Caring for my mother is not a desire I simply have, given that I'm already committed to go on living. Rather, caring for my mother is a desire that gives me reason to live. It gives my life meaning and purpose. Without any such desires, I may not have an interest in continuing to live. Hopefully I would, but we can grant for the sake of argument that at least that one would give me a reason to go on living. As Susan Wolf argues, our categorical desires are what motivationally root us to the world. So like ulterior interests, there can be a wide range of categorical desires. A desire to give back to my community may also sustain my interest in living, or my desire to see my work published, although that's more doubtful. Despite the variety of possible categorical desires that connect to loved ones are held by most of us, right? We desire to care for and be cared by our loved ones. We desire to share our lives with them. We desire to see them grow and flourish, and so on. These desires sustain our interest in living. Just as caring for my mother gives me reason to wake up in the morning, so does supporting a friend through a breakup, spending time with my dog, and seeing a friend succeed in their career. Because most of us have categorical desires in connection with our loved ones, our close relationships carry with them the motivational power to root most of us to the world. Now, consider cases of domestic violence. Of the isolating dynamic, psychiatrist Judith Herman writes, as long as the victim maintains any other human connection, the perpetrator's power is limited. It is for this reason that perpetrators universally seek to isolate their victims from any other source of information, material aid, or emotional support. Along with relentless accusations of infidelity, the batterer demands that his victim prove her loyalty to him by giving up her work and with it an independent source of income, her friendships, and even her ties to family. As described by Herman, a perpetrator severs the victim from their relationships to others in order to establish complete control, at least in paradigmatic cases. Out of fear for what will happen if she socializes, a victim may also withdraw, even when she's not physically restricted. A perpetrator may become jealous after a victim socializes with new friends and threaten violence or create other disincentives for socializing. They might pick fights, they might withdraw affection, they might act coldly and callously upon the victim's return home. As noted by Herman, the victim's friends may also be treated as bad influences or bad people by the abuser, creating a situation where victims must either be loyal to the perpetrator, the good influence, or to associate with the deviant. All right. Almost done. Without a social support network, victims may have nowhere else to go or no one else to turn to outside of this abusive relationship. Without friends and family who could bear witness, victims are left without anyone to testify to the violence or intervene. So the isolation keeps the victim from at least protecting their interest in physical security. Without someone to affirm their understanding of the abuse, victims may succumb to the perpetrator's gaslighting and believe the perpetrator's depiction of the abuse. The isolation thereby undermines the victim's interest in autonomously perceiving the world. But we can also understand the isolation as an important harm in itself, regardless of the victim's interest in physical security or autonomy. The victim may be left without reasons to go on living through this isolation or without reasons to escape. Or the victim may cling to her relationship with the perpetrator, desperate for some source of purpose in her life. To describe the loss of one's meaningful relationships as necessarily a loss of reasons to go on living might seem too stark. But insofar as most people find meaning in their social relationships, in most cases of domestic violence involve social isolation, we should be concerned that victims of domestic violence are often alienated from at least part of what makes their lives worth living. Taking away part of what gives someone reason to live is a serious harm in itself worth recognizing and condemning. It's the moral difference between smashing the left hand of a right-handed radio personality and smashing the left hand of a left-handed violinist. So we also have good reason to be suspicious of the potential for the victim to find purpose elsewhere. With the constant threat of violence, the victim may concentrate her will and energy on placating the perpetrator, leaving little time for projects and commitments of her own. A perpetrator may become jealous, not only of the people in the victim's life, but also of anything else that the victim seems to value. First-person narratives of domestic violence often recount perpetrators alienating victims, as I've mentioned, from religious commitments, from their work, and so on. To pursue an outside interest or to defer to any authority that goes above and beyond the perpetrator would, after all, give some source of power.
All right, 1 sec.
I can always unshare you if you'd like.
Yeah. So the font size is good. It's legible.
Yeah, it looks great for me.
And highlighting appears when I highlight.
Yes, it does.
Good. Excellent. So not slides exactly, but the next best thing.
You know, the distinction between slides and handout is very elusive in the Zoom talk era.
I guess we can think of it as just a slide, like on a playground.
And you will slide it up and down the screen, honestly. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. All the way down. I am pretty sure I can do this in 30 minutes.
Good. No worries.
Stephen, I'm going to have to leave a little bit early. Sorry about that in advance.
Your apology is graciously accepted.
And Stephen, so if it's okay, I'm just going to give people 2 more minutes to sneak back in, and then we'll just sort of all my deadlines will be 2 minutes later.
Okay.
Baby fellow's back.
Shiva, what is your baby's name?
This is Kira. She's looking
That's
forward
upsetting.
to eating plenty of Lunchables. Our fridge is already full of them.
And Shiva, I already told Macy you're going to follow up about abuse, so you're not off.
I've already followed up.
Okay. I'm just trying to bully you into it whatever way I can.
Thank you both for your emails. I haven't responded yet, but I saw them while walking my reactive dog.
Nice.
So when you say reactive dog, what do you mean by reactive?
She gets very angry when she sees trucks, so she'll lunge at them, she'll bark. So she makes many appearances in my seminars. Well, she makes herself known in many of my seminars from the work.
You could just call her my good dog.
Very good.
Is it in Republic Book 2 that Socrates suggests philosophers should be compared to dogs because they're hostile to anything they don't understand?
That sounds like that's exactly the thing. So choosing the talks for this conference was very difficult, and there were some great papers that I didn't get to include. But one thing that I'm really proud of is the sort of way that organizing a conference around the theme of the philosophy of conflict brings together, totally different perspectives, focusing from different parts of philosophy and thinking about where conflicts come from and how we deal with them in totally different ways. And so with that, again, Stephen, I'm not big on long introductions, but take it away for us.
All right. So about a third of the paper I submitted was me doing meandering philosophical reflections on this text, but I figured that we together can do much better meandering than I could do on my own. So I'm not going to do any during my presentation itself. This is going to be the 2/3 of the paper that is just exegesis, exegesis, exegesis. I'm going to try to bore into a little tiny piece of text that I have been quite in love with for some time. And to show you what's there, what might be there. A lot of my colleagues, like specialists in Chinese philosophy, would probably disagree with me in numerous points of detail, but I don't think they're here to disturb our conversation. So I'm going to be showing you something that is probably there in the text, although not exhaustively and not uncontroversially. So what is the topic of this little piece of text that we're going to bore into? Well, the topic is not any English word, not exactly, it's bien. But what is bien? Bien is debating or disputing, or a bit more literally or etymologically, drawing distinctions with words. When this text was composed, probably in or around the 3rd century BCE, bien was one of the normal things that philosophers did with their time. It was a professional competence. It was a form of socializing. Debating, disputing, trying to establish points by differentiating the world into various categories or sectors and arguing that certain things belonged in some sort of semantic zones of the world or in others. Exactly how they thought about distinction drawing and like the cognitive aspect of that is luckily not necessary for pursuing this conversation. I think if we just use our intuitions about debate or dispute, we're going to be on the money. So, I mean, we all have associations with debates and how they go well and how they go poorly. Those are definitely being talked about in any passage that is about bien in the classical Chinese corpus. So this little tiny piece of text asks a question. It actually asks a whole series of questions about bien. Questions it doesn't really answer, open-ended questions, maybe rhetorical questions, but in any case, possibly unanswerable ones. All of those questions revolve around this. Given that these things we call debates or disputes are lost and won in various straightforward senses of that word, who cares? Sort of like, what does it mean when somebody loses or wins a verbal confrontation in which they're trying to argue a point? Yeah, what does this have to do with being right? I should say something about the word I'm translating as right. Now, this is a subtlety that would be evident to speakers and readers of classical Chinese much more than to us. The word that stereotypically means right fundamentally means this one right here. And some philosophers in the classical Chinese tradition, not all of them, but some of them take advantage of the fact that it was originally a near demonstrative to make the argument that anybody trying to establish something as right is fundamentally involved in self-promotion and or philosophical nearsightedness. The text we're going to be looking at is in fact one of those texts, but people of a somewhat more straight up moralistic disposition, like Confucians, for instance, would not appreciate the association of rightness with mere thisness. They would try to associate it with something else. That, once again, is not crucial for understanding what's going to happen today in this text, but it might be fun to sort of keep on one of your back burners. This one right here would be understood at the very same time as the word right by people using this language in its original context. It just had conventionally come to mean something approved, preferred, correct, good, and so on. So what is bien? Once again, what is dispute or debate in the sense relevant to this text? Using reasoning, they had a theory of reasoning, theory of how to produce evidence. Using reasoning and evidence to show your listener what is right is what this word refers to. It's essential to notice that this is a public verbal performance. It shouldn't be understood as a mental activity or an abstract form of inference or something like that. It's a social activity where people use words to prove a point, basically. And its intended effect is to make something obvious to somebody to whom it is not yet obvious. Somebody is in the dark about the fact that the following thing is right. And so as a debater or a disputer, I'm going to point out to them why it's right in the hope of inducing a shift of judgment in them. So where does our text come from? It's a teeny tiny brick. You might say like a golden or platinum brick in a giant edifice. And this giant edifice is the Zhuangzi. This would not have been true 20 years ago, but I think it's true now. A lot of professional philosophers have heard of the Zhuangzi by this point, Anglophone philosophers. It's been making the rounds increasingly as a touchstone for people who want to think about philosophy comparatively, particularly under headings like relativism and skepticism, which are headings I am personally very fond of. You can think of the Zhuangzi, like people are going to say the Zhuangzi was a book written by Zhuangzi and or the Zhuangzi is a book that represents Taoism. As I say in the piece of text I'm currently highlighting, I don't particularly like those approaches. Don't think of this as a particular man's views. I think it's a debilitating habit in my culture's reading practices of texts like these. And don't ask whether or not this is Taoist. That'll just confuse everything. Think of the Zhuangzi instead. This is my personal recommendation. Think of it as a kind of source book of counterculture. The Zhuangzi has played the role of a kind of subversive or disconcerting alternative to normal mainstream ways of talking and thinking in East Asian intellectual culture since it first appeared, 3rd century BC, give or take. In particular, if you ask whether this is by Zhuangzi or like whether it represents Taoism, and you're a reader of this text, you're likely to overlook a lot of the complexity and variety and just utter bizarreness of the actual contents of this text. All of those little individual bricks made of different materials with different designs embossed on them. But that polemic is perhaps better served for for people who read the text on a regular basis. So how many passages in the Zhuangzi talk about bien? One, and this is it. That's not quite fair. Bien comes up in, I don't know, a half dozen or a dozen places. This is the only concerted treatment of it. So some of you here may be able to read Chinese up to and including classical Chinese. So I've included the Chinese of the text that I'll be translating, but I'm only going to be obviously reading the English translation. This translation is my translation. Some specialists might disagree with some aspects of it. Here we go. Suppose you and I have gotten into a debate. If you defeat me and I don't defeat you, does that mean that you're really right and I'm really wrong? If I defeat you and you don't defeat me, does that mean that I'm really right and you're really wrong? So that's the very first little chunk of text I want us to look at. And I think that part of my role here today will just be exegeting as much as possible based on my experience with this text and its surrounding intellectual culture. Defeat, as it's being envisioned here, has got to be some kind of social event. Because bien is a social activity. When you dispute or debate something, you're actually using words to try to change somebody's mind. And if you're defeated in doing that, what is that going to look like? The text doesn't specify, but it probably amounts to somebody actually having their mind changed. That's what it might mean to lose a debate. It might amount to somebody just growing discouraged or dispirited or counting themselves out of the conversation. That's one way of losing a verbal fight, is just getting discouraged or being persuaded, changing or leaving. Another way you could lose a debate is if there's some kind of umpire or some kind of audience or some kind of, I don't know, professor or expert who's being consulted as to who lost and who won, and they say who lost and who won. So for the little piece of text in point 4, we should be envisioning that somebody has just either been humiliated or has grown discouraged or has been declared a loser by an authority figure or whatever, any social way of cashing out a lost argument. Who cares that they lost the argument is what's going on. How many arguments have we lost and won in the course of our philosophical careers? And I mean, what does it really amount to in any particular case? A lot seems to depend on like who the audience is, what kind of mood you're in, whether somebody was clever with their words or was able to outfox somebody else, whether somebody was ill-informed or misinformed or properly informed. As I say in 5, this question, does it mean that the winner was right and the loser was wrong? I think you could say it's a persistent question. It's a robust question that doesn't really go away. And the reason it doesn't go away is people always can have differences of opinion about who should have won the fight. It's kind of like if you want to think in sporting terms or military history terms, we can be upset by certain victories. We can be upset by certain defeats and think that so-and-so should have won. If the other guy had won, things would have gone better for everyone. We have an analog for that when it comes to debating and disputing points, where we lament the fact that somebody lost when they shouldn't have. They should have won. What that means is we think they're right in spite of the fact that they lost. That's a very, very easy thought that we have on a regular basis. All that person needed was a better argument, or they just had bad luck that day, or the umpire was biased, or whatever. We do not feel comfortable reducing rightness to just the fact of winning a debate. But we do keep engaging in debates because we're trying to establish that something is right. There's a kind of tension here in the very interest people have in carrying on debates. They're proceeding as though they can establish what's right, but they're not ultimately comfortable reducing rightness to performance in verbal sport of that kind. And I say here, and this is certainly going beyond anything the text explicitly says, but we wish that people would reduce rightness to winning as long as we're the one winning. That would be very convenient for us. And as long as we're not winning, we hope that they will not reduce rightness to winning. Letting somebody else carry the day, actually having your mind changed, which is unstable, which can go all kinds of different ways over time, caving into pressure that you rationalize in some fashion, appealing to people who are not really in a better epistemic position than the contestants themselves. These are what winning and losing actually look like, and it is messy as hell. Being right seems to be something that's not messy. It seems to be something kind of pristine or basic or simple that we're trying to prove by engaging in debates, almost different in kind from descriptions of how the debates go, including who is accorded a win or a loss. The next question the text asks is it that one of us is right and the other is wrong? Or is it that both of us are right and both of us are wrong? Once again, the text doesn't actually answer this question. But to see how motivated it is in our own experiences, I think we can say, you know, both sides went in being convinced that they were right. And frequently both sides are still convinced that they're right afterwards. Is it crazy to assume that maybe they're right in thinking they're right? Two sides might be both right and wrong simultaneously, depending on what way of looking at the situation you choose, depending on what criterion you want to raise up as the appropriate criterion, conformity with which would make somebody right versus wrong. Different points of view, different agendas, different frameworks. One thing that I think this text is appealing to is a general interest in the idea that debating sort of carries on in denial of multiplicity. To really be committed to a certain dispute, whether performatively or otherwise, is to be committed to denying the relevance of multiple possibilities, the relevance of multiple ways of life, the relevance of multiple perspectives, criteria, as I say. And simply thinking about how confusing and frustrating it is to sort of score and track people's success at establishing their points could make one seriously ask whether rightness is the kind of thing that can ultimately be assigned to one side or the other. So the next thing the text says is, and this is really interesting, if you and I can't understand each other, then anyone else would certainly be subjected to the darkness involved. Now, in the paper I submitted, I sort of bore into this at great length. I think there's enormous interest in the fact that what people are failing to understand is not the topic. It is not the referent of the expressions they're using. It's not the state of affairs. It's not the fact of the matter. It's one another. Human beings fail to understand each other when there's winning and losing a debate, according to the implicit logic of the text as it is proceeding. No reference is made, well, I would say in the entire anthology, let alone in this brick of the anthology. No reference is made to getting things wrong, like in situations of contestation. In situations of contestation, there's a sort of a humane failure. There's an ad hominem failure to understand each other. Now, what kind of darkness is involved in people failing to understand each other? So let's say that I don't understand you. What don't I understand about you if we're having a fight or a confrontation or something? I don't understand where you're coming from. I don't understand your framework. I don't understand your life experience. I don't understand what you're taking for granted. When people find each other disgusting or objectionable, I think you could say, and I like to think the text would say with me, what appalls each person about the other, like if I find you appalling, it's because you don't understand where I'm coming from. Where I'm coming from is completely self-evidently correct, obvious, a starting point as far as I'm concerned. And I can't believe you wouldn't appreciate that. And I think we can assume that the other person will often return the favor. And that's what appalls people, not so much being wrong about a fact or the truth of the matter, so much as just not getting me. Remember that association that the language permits between being right and being this one right here. Why don't you understand this, where this perspective is coming from, is the kind of thing that I think can efficiently account for anger and, dare I say, ressentiment, alluding back to an earlier paper today, much more than something as austere and removed as a fact of the matter. Once again, I'm trying to sort of ventriloquize the text when I say this. Right, ignorance or incomprehension of the perspectives, criteria, and other points of reference that I understand is what I might find appalling in somebody else. Winning and losing, whatever these actually amount to in practice, socially, always, or let us say typically, perpetuate mutual misunderstanding by ensuring that people are disconnected from each other because they're approaching each other in a spirit of rivalry. Sort of, if you presuppose rivalry, and you conduct yourself in a rivalrous way, the only predictable outcome is rivalry, meaning nothing has really been overcome, no matter who wins or loses, as manifest in the situation where both people are convinced that they must be right somehow, even if they appear to have lost on a verbal level. After all, here they are, right here. They're coming from somewhere. They can't be entirely wrong. That would almost be equivalent to not existing, and nobody doesn't exist when they're trying to prove a point. So, given that the two debaters in our passage have reached an impasse where they don't understand each other, it's so interesting to look at what they think the appropriate solution might be. Not investigation of a referent, not, I don't know, data sampling, not thinking really hard or doing conceptual analysis or something like that, but just phoning a friend, to use an increasingly out-of-date reference to Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. Phoning a friend is, on the implication of this text, what people do when they try to have a next move, like beyond the initial failure to communicate with somebody they don't agree with. As the text says, whom shall I bring in to correct it, or to correct us, to rectify the situation? The unmediated investigation of objects is not on the table. Very little is firm about things according to this piece of the Zhuangzi, but if there is something firm, cool, it means like to hold fast. The thing that holds fast about things is that they get taken in different ways by different people. That's the one thing you can say with absolute steadfastness about things, according to these guys, or whoever wrote this, we don't know. Definitely wasn't Zhuangzi, I'll say that much. So if the one thing we can hold on to with assurance is that things are taken in various ways, and it's also the case that something is not being understood when people fall into debate with one another, that sort of explains why it would be that what they fail to understand is each other, not the things. The standpoints or criteria that I fail to keep in view, if I were to really appreciate them and keep them in view, they would be extremely informative about my opponent. I could learn a hell of a lot about that person's life, about their values, about their emotions, if I understood their standards, if I understood their criteria. And I think the text would say, via that understanding of the person, I can understand the object the way they do. As opposed to just, I can't approach the object the way they do cold. I can't just put myself in a different position than the one I already have without consulting them and sort of assume that now I am really approaching the object the way they do. I think these guys would say, like, you actually need to understand the person, and from that basis, in humane understanding, approach the object in a different fashion, if you want to actually move beyond the impasse of mutual misunderstanding. So having asked, whom exactly shall we bring in? The text then does a tetralemma, a sort of fourfold split. I didn't translate this because it would be tedious, but basically what the text says is, if he agrees with me, what help would he be? If he agrees with you, what help would he be? If he agrees with neither one of us, what help would he be? If he agrees with both of us, what help would he be? It's very laconic. It's not explained explicitly to the reader why this is the natural sequence of questions. But I think that as readers of the text, we can supply reasons pretty readily for why this is a natural train of thought to carry out. So let's say I phone a friend and this person agrees with my position. Well, great. Is being right a question of numbers? Like, people are able to continue perceiving themselves right, even if the whole world is against them. What does that have to do with being right or wrong at the end of the day? You can imagine, as I say here, any complicated social history you want of like one position or the other gaining adherence, losing adherence, splintering, reuniting. Think of it as a kind of social drama of people changing their minds and like giving like a different amount of population weight to different opinions, different positions. None of that fundamentally informs us about what is right, if being right is supposed to be beyond all contest. Because the whole picture is one of massive contestation. It's a constant push and pull when people are adding and subtracting numbers of loyal adherents to different, I mean, think about the history of like interreligious strife or something. That's a great way to think about why it would be natural to ask, what do numbers have to do with rightness? So that covers horns 1 and 2 of the tetralemma. The third horn, well, what if he agrees with neither one of us? Now the situation just got even more complicated than it already was, because we have to deal with a third position that may not make sense to either one of us. So whether we are swelling or diminishing sides or adding additional sides, this could be over minutes, this could be over thousands of years, as I write here. As long as it's all being done as a form of verbal contestation, I think this text would say, everybody involved in that contestation is basically in the same situation as everybody else is. They're partly aware of the standpoints and criteria that are relevant to the discussion, and they're not equally aware of the other standpoints and criteria that their opponents are using. Because if they were as aware, as appreciative of their opponent's standards as they would be of their own, the contestation would not be happening. So what about the fourth horn of the tetralemma? Somebody who agrees with both people. Well, try to imagine the spectacle of like 2 or 3 people having a vigorous debate about your favorite controversial topic, whatever it might be. And a fourth person coming in and saying, guys, relax, I got this. You're not really disagreeing with each other. We can all join hands. We can shake hands and smile and have, because there's no real contest here. We all think the same thing at the end of the day. That's frequently infuriating. I think we could say, I can say that from experience. Because as I put in the parentheses here, opposing opposition is a form of opposition. I don't have any automatic reason to agree with you that I agree with my opponent if, as far as I can tell, my opponent and I really do see things differently. To the extent that I have a way of life, that I have a way of taking things that is robust, I don't necessarily want it to be forgotten or obliterated, which would tend to follow if I were to truly accept, or if it were to be true that I just agree with my foe at the level that really matters. So this is my fast and loose expansion of the extremely laconic tetralemma, whose point is basically, we can take the how can they fix the situation as a rhetorical question. Bringing people in doesn't solve anything. It doesn't enable us to say with full conviction who is right, no matter who they agree or disagree with. At that point, the text zooms out a little bit and sort of sums itself up. These transforming sounds' mutual reliance is like their lack of mutual reliance. Now, it takes working with the text to explain what that means. This is a somewhat speculative reconstruction on my part. What I take it to mean is that if I'm all alone defending my position, if there's like a split screen where on one side of the screen, I'm the only person who thinks this. And on the other side of the screen, I and 10,000 of my friends all agree with this and we're all saying it at the same time. Those two pictures are the same when it comes to the question of whether we're ultimately right in so doing. The number of allies you have has nothing to do with whether you're right. The question hasn't really progressed beyond the initial moment. Why? Because contestation is still the activity. It's still in the air. Contestation is the kind of thing people only do against resistance, against some sort of real or live alternative that somebody else is bringing to their attention. Now, there's more tied up in this reference to transforming sounds than we might think right away. If one looks at our little golden brick of the edifice in context, if one looks at a couple other bricks right nearby it, one can supplement the picture by saying, this is a text that loves asking whether speech is different from other kinds of sound. It doesn't answer that question. This text tends not to answer the questions it raises, but you can come up with reasons for saying maybe the fact that my speech appears to refer to things is deceptive, that it's not really that different from non-referring sound, like ambient noise or music, to the extent that music doesn't refer, which I take no stand on. Not being a philosopher of music, it might refer in some sense. Point is, all these questions are really vital as far as the text is concerned. Because if we're not even sure that our speech refers to anything, let alone what it refers to, especially when people appear to be referring to different things with the same word, what is the conversation about? It might not be about anything, which means that if we're looking for some kind of practical resolution to the issue, it would be something like suspending judgment about whether there even is a topic, suspending judgment about whether there are any reference to be had from the conversation. Also, the text makes other arguments that we don't know why things happen. Bada boom. And so I'm conscious that I should speed up a little bit. The implicit advice is that instead of either trying to do a better job of describing a referent or explaining why somebody is saying what they're saying, engage it as an audible phenomenon. Now, what does that mean? It means engaging speech as sound that you may or may not wish to be listening to. It begs far fewer questions than engaging speech as something that refers to an object that you can specify and know better than the other person does. So there's a certain kind of labor that is called for. I'm going to have to speed up, obviously. There's a certain kind of labor that is called for in resolving debates, this text would say. And it's not the labor of understanding reference better. And it's not the labor of explaining why people are saying what they're saying, however thought-provoking one's favorite punditry might be. It has more to do with the skills we expect from musicians: listening, anticipating, harmonizing, creating and resolving chordal tension, cueing people either to start playing or to stop playing, and improvising. If we don't like how someone sounds, we do, of course, have a pretty concrete interest in making them sound different. Improving how they sound, maybe shutting them up entirely or excluding them from the range of things which we can hear. And I think that the Zhuangzi in general would say, that's a lot more real and a lot more live and a lot easier to work with than the question of rightness. Sorry, just looking at something. Rightness is something like an abstraction from that, rather than what motivates it. It's not so much that I'm right and I know I'm right and that's why I don't like what you're saying. It actually goes in the other direction. Something about what you're saying really rubs me the wrong way and I don't know what it is. But it must be because what you're saying is wrong. That's a kind of approach to this that the Zhuangzi writers, I think, would heartily endorse. So what am I supposed to use to harmonize voices, assuming that it's productive to go about making the soundscape better, which I think these guys are advising? How are you going to do it? What's your tool going to be? As a sinologist, I can assure you there's no easy answer. It's a baffling text with lots of corruption. I think we ultimately don't know what this phrase means, but I can also reassure you, as somebody who's worked with chapter 2 of the Zhuangzi for a long time, it has something to do with the fact that the referents are not known. And it has something to do with the fact that people don't know why they're talking in the first place. If you don't know what the referent is of your conversation and you don't know why anybody is saying what they're saying, that's a starting point for responding adeptly to troubling or ugly conversation, according to these guys. There is, skipping past, an all-encompassing craze of provisional standards and perspectives that is probably also being alluded to by this very difficult expression. So apparently, to make conversations better, you need to rely on the all-encompassing craze of provisional standards. Now, in the last 5 minutes, we really hit the mother lode. This is a little sentence that I find so fascinating that I make a very, very eccentric argument about it in my paper. I don't know that I've seen this interpretation of the line before in other scholars' work, so don't trust it. But here's what I think it says. If this /right/so is really this /right/so, then its difference from its opposite does not involve debate. Now, the word I'm translating is really. It has connotations of at the end of the day, decisively, conclusively. It has connotations of the end or fruition of a process. The claim is that if X is in some final or conclusive way X, debate is not relevant to that fact. Debate doesn't tell you about that fact. It doesn't proceed from that fact. Debate is irrelevant, basically, to the fact that something really is the way that it is. And in context, I think one productive way to interpret this is to say that if you want to know what is decisively right, what is really so, what is really this, why would you concern yourself with confrontational situations in the first place? Like, why would you be concerned with disagreements and entrenched debates and irresolvable questions? Don't those seem to show you instability and ambiguity rather than conclusiveness? Something I wish I had time to talk about is that this text defends the idea that things are however they're taken to be. So there's another big thing to drop on you all at once. If things are as they are taken to be, what's firm about things is that they are taken in many ways. And you and I are having a conversation where X is being taken in two contradictory ways. it doesn't have a conclusive identity. X is just internally divided by virtue of being the apparent referent of two voices that are saying contradictory things about it. Another way of, an entailment of that is that if a confrontation is not happening, if ugly music is not going on, if a contradiction about X is not being asserted by two or more voices, X doesn't have any problems. There is no question about what X is when there's no questioning of what X is. Hence, what is ultimately the case is never really on the table in debates concerning what's the case. The conclusive ways of treating X are abundant. They are encompassing. They are lively. They are textural. They're basically our life when we're not having disagreements or raising questions. The ways we have of taking things that are actually conclusive and decisive may not be the ways we actually find ourselves voicing in the setting of debate. Because the pressures of confrontation and judgment and comparison of multiple possibilities can make us talk and think in ways that are very different from the ways we talk and think when we're not being disturbed by that kind of social kerfuffle. So what I would say on behalf of these authors is that if you see a debate going on, however vigorous, however honest, what's going on is that everybody is trying to recover the finality that their judgments have when they're not being challenged. And they're trying to recover the finality their judgments have when they're not being challenged through a process of challenging somebody. And there's something really weird about that. As I put it here, they're trying to get back to where they were, but they're trying to do it by going through somebody else, like a door. I can get back to the certainty that I can presuppose when I'm not having an argument by defeating you because you're in my way. Is it any mystery that all such victories can be contested? So what is this actually going to look like in practice? Yeah, all right, I have to really skip through this. Appreciate a range of lives that they don't live. Luckily, we're going to have a lot of time to talk about this, so I don't have to be particularly helpful or complete in running through my points here. Skilled in speaking at ways that stimulate the ability to appreciate other points of view. It's going to involve, I think, a lot of social slips and slides, potentially unpredictable, potentially ambiguous or dishonest verbal behavior if one's imperative is to make the soundscape better, rather than to try to prove a point in any kind of consistent, thereby question-begging way. And so to really race through my final point, the final piece of advice our little chunk of Zhuangzi gives us is go along with them by means of, and then there's a difficult to translate expression. One of the words means like both big and beautiful. There's some kind of vast or impressive thing going on. But the other one is kind of disgusting and disorderly, overflowing, overrunning, or spilling out. What I take this to mean, again, based on my whole acquaintance with Zhuangzi's thought and all of that, is that people are disgusting. People are unpredictable. They spill all over the place. There's something glorious and grand about this. And only by catching on to that fact about them in real time and actually responding to how they're out of control and overflowing, is it possible to be adept at dealing with the kinds of things that would less adeptly be dealt with by disputing. I'm going to stop there because I have to. And we obviously have a lot to talk about. So let's do that.
Thank you, Steven. Again, I'll take hands in the Zoom format, and I'm just going to go ahead and start with mine while people sort of think about their questions. But Steven, could you share your bring your hand up back up?
Yes, I can. Here it is.
And could you go to the top of page 2?
Yes.
One thing I think a lot about in thinking about what philosophy can tell us about conflict is that conflict involves behavior between people. And so a lot of what philosophy is going to have to shed light on it is going to be through making it intelligible in some way. And that's either going to involve sort of showing how we end up with conflicting goals. And Paul told us some this morning about how we can end up with sort of these values in ways that like could be in conflict with one another. But the other way, of course, is even if we have the same goals, sometimes we have different understandings of what's going on. And so I like that in the debate or resolution, there's disagreement, And so we're looking at one of those ingredients for making intelligible how people could be in conflict with one another. But there's the second layer that comes out in this this point 7 here, and that you got to in your penultimate point, which is that it's not just that the disagreement is like this sort of epistemic source of how we're in conflict with one another. I think in this point, you also bring out, or that you point to where the text suggests something that I think comes out in lots of interpersonal conflicts, which is that there's something that we're in conflict about, but then it becomes about us in being in conflict about it, that somehow, like, there's like, we could be, you know, debating about math or about philosophy or about something else, politics, and then so it's point 8 where you have it, where what debaters typically understand is each other, and that's often what's very unsatisfactory to us about being in conflicts, is that not just that we're not getting what we want, but in like the really hard kinds of interpersonal conflicts, it's not just that we don't get the outcome that we want, but that the other person there is sort of, it's frustrating that they're not going that way. And I really like that thought is there, because that seems to be a piece of lots of loaded interpersonal conflicts to me, that it's not just that we're not getting what we want, but that it's frustrating that the other person's not understanding that we want it or not accommodating themselves to us. I thought that was a really interesting piece.
I do have something to say about that.
Please.
So people associate this text with Taoism. I didn't mention the word Tao, nor should I. It's too complicated. But a Tao is a way of doing something. And for this little bit of text, Taos are multiple and they proliferate indefinitely. Any kind of action sort of coalesces a way of life out of nothing on the basis of previous ways of life, but in a way that is fundamentally spontaneous and unpredictable. And one thing I wrote about when I was trying to meanderingly think through the implications in my paper is that verbal performances in this text come from different ways of life, different Taos. And so when people find themselves performing rivalrously with one another, I think this text would say it's a grave mistake to then simply begin looking at what they say as though its significance were obvious or self-explanatory. Because what they say is, I don't want to say an epiphenomenon, but it's almost just it's a fruit of a lifestyle in every case. And to the extent that people find themselves rivalrous or disagreeing with each other on a verbal level, I think that these guys would say the basis of that has to be a difference in way of life. And so like the more quickly we come clean about the difference in way of life being what's driving us, like the quicker the conversation can resolve, instead of being distracted by the truth or falsity of assertions being made.
Thanks, Stephen. Sumit, and then Paul, and then Jonathan.
Thanks, Stephen. I think this is just a clarification question about the stuff that was happening at the very end. So I think what I was wondering most about is in suggesting that we should harmonize, is the big reason behind that we should be abandoning our desires for finality that you had referenced earlier? Like, is it that by abandoning that desire, that kind of leads us down the path of harmonizing with others? Is that the way to understand what's going on?
That's a great question. I think that abandoning the desire for finality is actually an intermediate justification. The only explicit reason that the text provides for doing anything it says is not dying. So specifically, like living out your years in good health is actually what it thinks you will get out of harmonizing behavior. And there are many different ways to explain why they would say that. I'll name the two that are most salient. Interpersonal or social harmony plays a very great role in not having people hurt you, is one obvious one. Maintaining harmonious relationships is massively beneficial if you can succeed in pulling it off. Number two, and this is a real, you could say, preoccupation of a lot of early Chinese thinkers, and it filters into later Taoist traditions. there's real conviction around the idea that ill health is caused by excessive emotions. And that there's no mind-body dualism. And so like any kind of thing that we would describe as a mental state or a cognitive disposition or whatever has some kind of physical expression. And ill health follows from various kinds of cognitive sclerosis and emotional extremes. I think that's probably in view when these guys say, harmonize if you want. It's like the Terminator, come with me if you want to live. Like, harmonize if you want to live, otherwise you'll make yourself sick. Is that a help? It's only a partial answer to the concern you're bringing up, I think.
Yeah, I guess like, yeah, maybe I'll say something vague. Hopefully it's helpful. Like in terms of what you just said, like there's a difference between harmony and like people just like agreeing with each other, if that makes sense. Like I feel like harmony connotes like, I don't know, more of a sense of like being in sync. And if the kind of conclusion of the passage you were talking about is like, let's stop debating, let's harmonize, like I feel like there's a very different interpretation of that, which is just like, let's just go along with what other people say. But that seems very different than harmonizing. Yeah, I don't know if that was helpful.
Well, it's helpful in that it points to how complicated the issues are. I want to say one thing, and then by the time I'm done saying it, I'll probably have forgotten the other points you were making, unfortunately. But here's one thing. The whole tradition, starting with Confucius, draws a distinction between agreement and harmony. So agreement is definitely not what is being sought. And we can think of this the same way as musical harmony. I mean, unison, I suppose, is one form of harmony, but the harmonies we really love tend to be thirds and fifths and so on. And like harmonies among singers and instruments of very different timbres and things like that. So the ability to be together in a way that feels good presupposes that the two people are not the same. And that's much more what this text is going for than any kind of agreement.
Thanks.
Paul, Jonathan, and then Paul.
Thanks. Yeah, I was actually going to ask about something similar about this idea of harmony. And I'm just thinking about how to formulate my question in light of what's been said. So I was struck by the thing you said about like 2/3 of the way through the talk, that there's an assumption at work here that things are as they're taken to be, right? And I was wondering about how that interacts with this stuff about dispute and harmonization. I mean, I guess if you take seriously that idea that things are however they're taken to be, if you just eliminate dissenting voices, then you've fixed the way that things are, right? And also if you harmonize voices, you've, I guess, done the same thing. So I was wondering if that's right so far, why harmonization is supposed to be preferable to the resolution of disputes by defeating the opponent. So in other words, if you can achieve convergence on the views of whatever matters under discussion in two ways, you can either like integrate opposed voices into some new view, which I think is what's connoted by harmonization, or you can just get rid of opposing views, either by convincing the people that they're wrong and so forth. Why is the one taken to be better than the other, or what standard are we invoking to privilege the one over the other? That's sort of what I'm wondering about. Does that make sense?
It definitely makes sense. It's a thought-provoking question. So I'm just going to take even more seriously the concrete musical reference to harmonizing. So let's say that you're a singer who wants to find a co-singer to harmonize with. And you just kind of eliminate candidates one by one because you don't think they sound very good with you. And you're left all alone. You're not in a position to harmonize with anybody if you're not going to accept anybody as somebody to sing with you. Now, when it comes to eliminating voices, that has connotations that are as dark as you want. I mean, this tradition is very frank about the physical danger that people pose to each other. It's very engaged in governmental thinking generally. And so like, silencing people you don't agree with in the culture that produced the Zhuangzi frequently looks like purging them or something like that. And so silencing people you disagree with I think these guys see it as posing a lot of danger to oneself and to other people, to which they will understandably object. And so, yeah, the text is very vague, but I think what it's maybe going for is the idea that if we're going to be together, we got to find a way of being together. And it's not going to involve anybody having no voice at all. Or I'm not sure what it's going. Yeah. Was that a helpful, at least preliminary answer?
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. So I guess I was initially thinking that the grounds for privileging harmonization over other resolutions would just be what we think of as purely epistemic grounds, but it sounds like they're not. It sounds like there's some moral values or some practical considerations that are in the background, and that in light of those, harmonization is to be preferred. Is that the idea?
So there is some epistemic reasoning that goes on in this text. Not this brick, but the bricks around it in the Zhuangzi are skeptical. I mentioned skepticism about reference and about causation. This text, by which I mean like this chunk, the bricks around it, and the Zhuangzi as a whole, it's very complicated, but like this tradition generally does not prioritize the quest to know things. It tends to think that either you basically know whatever you need to know, and or there's almost nothing you can know, and or knowing things is directly counterproductive to flourishing in some way, and or trying to know more is very counterproductive to flourishing. And so like epistemology is relevant for the skeptical stuff, and I think for very little else. Skepticism, of course, doesn't provide us with any first order normative values. It's just a bunch of questions that are not being answered. I think the first order normative value is, well, I'm going to go back again to what the text explicitly says: health. Health for oneself and health for the people that one has a stake in keeping healthy.
Okay, thanks. It's very helpful.
Jonathan and then Paul.
Cool, hi. I wanted to ask also about, I think it was number 7 on the handout, the business about the oppositional kind of winning-losing thing is going to inevitably result in ignorance and incomprehension and the like. I guess I wanted to hear a little bit more about like what kinds of interactions are being discussed here. In part because while it's certainly true that the kinds of arguments that came to mind during your talk quite often seem to have this sort of problem. It didn't strike me as plausibly inevitably true, or even always generally true. And certainly I don't think oppositionality in general is like that. When my friends and I like decide to have a competitive race, we do kind of end the race knowing who won, and indeed considering the matter settled, at least like who was faster on that day. Like sports are quite often like that. Not quite always, but like that's the normal case for sports. And things like that occasionally happen in intellectual arguments. I have sometimes realized that I was wrong about something by losing an argument, and then I changed my mind, and we all kind of consider the matter settled. Are those observations like inconsistent with what's being said here, or are we talking about like a more a more toxic or inappropriate or hopeless kind of exchange?
Yeah, fantastic question. One of the bricks near this brick gives us a lot of information about what bien is as a mode of discourse. It just ready for some Zhuangzi people. It distinguishes the following kinds of discourse, and these are massively interpreted by me. These are not literal translations, but granting that something is out there, talking something through, giving an opinion, and bien. Those are 4 modes of discourse. And I think that what that means is that, well, bien is not just a matter of offering an opinion. And it's not just a matter of talking things through. Talking things through, the text approves of in many cases. Like if there are things in the world that need to be talked through, you talk through them. Sometimes opinions need to be issued because they're practically needful if something needs to be done. Bien, I think, is supposed to be different from those in terms of it being primarily a search for victory. Bien is the kind of discourse that has a winner and a loser, whereas issuing an opinion and or talking things through, I think doesn't have a winner and a loser, like at least to the same degree. Maybe you can think of it as a dial of what's the Greek term, philonikia, like love of victory. Like when you the more you dial it up, the more you get toward bien, and the more you dial it down, the more you get toward just talking things through or granting that something is there. How's that for a first response?
That helps, although the love of victory doesn't feel like it's going to be enough to distinguish from, like, say, sports cases, where that's certainly present. I can be very motivated to win and yet fully recognize that I lost.
Right. And I think that, so if the question is, so like on the one hand, how is bien different from other kinds of conversation? On the other hand, how is bien different from other kinds of contests? Like, I don't know, a sporting contest, a military contest. I think what's different is that, and again, like, I haven't spent that much time either engaging in or thinking about sports, but being right doesn't seem to be on the table in sports rivalries. I mean, a lot could be on the table in terms of how people see themselves, but like having the correct view is not, unless you have like a legal system that involves trial by ordeal or something like that. But yeah, this notion of having the correct view is, I think, what distinguishes bien from other kinds of contest.
Yeah, thanks. So it's winning and losing in this particular kind of framework, not the general idea of winning and losing.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Uh-huh.
Oh, go ahead.
Okay. Hello. So I like Hobbes. And Hobbes, a central kind of issue in Hobbes is sort of also these kinds of disagreements that appear, right? Disputes and this disagreement between people, especially for Hobbes, a lot of like religious disagreement and all that kind of stuff. And so when you were going through this, I was sort of like comparing the kind of like suggestions here from like what Hobbes says. And Hobbes's solution to these kinds of disagreements is, well, we need to institute a sovereign to create like a kind of unified body to just sort of resolve these disputes and like go on with that. I guess to sort of use the like musical analogy that seems to get used here, it's like you might think of the sovereign just becomes the conductor of the orchestra, right? Instead of each person just playing their own part or at their own tempo and whatnot, you have a single conductor sort of guiding it and sort of directing how it works. So, and that seems very different from what's being suggested here. So I guess my just very general thought is, is there a particular kind of reason why the kind of, getting to harmony via this kind of submission to some kind of central authority meant to resolve these disputes is dispreferred in this kind of tradition for like, fixing the kind of like, issues that arise from disagreement and so forth like that. Does that make sense?
It makes sense. And it's a very core aspect of the classical Chinese conversation. So these guys named Mohists, who are infinitely less famous today than the Confucians, they're great rivals, but were about equally famous at the time. These guys called Mohists have frequently been compared to Hobbes because in, I guess, the 5th century BC, they make a very similar argument that there's, well, I mean, in their case, they specify it as people left to their own devices proliferate normative disagreements with each other. Normative disagreements about right and wrong can proliferate so fast that they endanger the integrity of families and put everybody in danger, which is why everybody, I mean, it's not specified who, but there must be chosen a sovereign who can embody rightness and who can compel people to adhere to rightness in a sort of hierarchical way. So Confucians didn't agree with that, but for those curious, most of the famous bien that we have from early China is Confucians versus Mohists about some public policy topic or other. Like what kind of burials are the right kind of burials? What kind of love for your family is the right kind of loving family? And I think that the guys responsible for the Zhuangzi, while to some extent participating in those conversations, or at least witnessing them, were very dismayed by a lot of the implications, not just for personal well-being, but also for political systems. Politically, they tend toward anarchism, at least at the level of rhetoric, anarchism and primitivism. Some more practical versions of Zhuang's thought actually try to fuse this kind of conversation, this that we were talking about today, with some kind of commitment to a hierarchical political structure. So it actually can be done. But essentially, I should have said crucially, when this kind of thinking gets linked to positive structured political commitments, it's crucial that they say the monarch does not embody what's right, and in fact doesn't know what's right, and in fact encourages people to pursue their own ends through his structural role as a monarch. It's super complicated. I feel like I'm only scratching the surface of your concerns.
No, that's interesting, because I think Hobbes's suggestion is very similar in many ways, that he prefers that the sovereign make no more laws than necessary for the maintenance of the society, so that people have freedom to sort of pursue their own ends. It gets complicated in various ways, but interesting.
Cool.
Yeah.
We got a question from Chris.
I think that's me. I'm an interloper. I'm sorry. You probably think I'm Audrey, but I'm not Audrey. But I am somebody who works on Asian philosophy, so I was excited to encounter this paper. Thank you, Stephen. I think my question is, I mean, your answer then to that last question sort of provoked this a little bit in my mind when you said that most of the bien is taking place between the Confucians and the Mohists. And my sense is that seems correct. And that part of the reason why the Zhuangzi has this little passage here is actually to kind of disparage the idea that engaging in this kind of dispute is helpful at all. And indeed to sort of set this position in opposition to, in some ways, that Confucian and Mohist kind of obsession with getting names right? And so what I'm really interested in, I wonder if you could say something a bit more about this, is, one of the things that's fascinating about the Zhuangzi, and particularly the Lao Tzu before, is the kind of suspicion and the skepticism about language's ability or capacity to express anything that's right at all, right? And that one of the great innovations in the Zhuangzi, I think, is, as you said earlier, is that kind of push away from politics into kind of self-cultivation and well-being of people, right? And that one of the possible readings of this brick is that the best thing to do is to recognize at the outset that rightness is not something we can ever argue about or argue our way into, right? It's a different kind of knowledge. And so why do we have to be invested in who wins and who loses this? Could be me, could be you, could be the person who we phone. Doesn't matter, right? And actually all of us are wrong in some sense. And that the healthiest thing for us to do is to accept that at the outset and not engage in bien. That bien is just something that's going to screw us up and make us stressed and give us ulcers and all of this stuff, right? So I guess I wondered if that's not quite your reading of this, right? But that's always been my sort of reading of this section. I wondered if you had thoughts on it.
It's not identical to my reading, but I don't see much conflict either. I love the phrase you used a minute ago, which I typed, I hope accurately, as rightness is not the kind of thing we can argue ourselves into. That's a wonderful way of putting it. So I want to say something, first of all, yes, across all points, but in terms of specific things to pull out of what you said to respond to, people who who do philosophy in a modern Western way, I think they're going to find their siblings, their spiritual siblings in early China among the Mohists primarily. The Mohists are not famous today in terms of like the long-term inheritance of the ancient schools of thought. But from the perspective of many Western philosophers, this is something of a tragedy because the Mohists were committed to using careful reasoning to clarify correct doctrines in the hope of like ethically improving society, which is like significantly closer to a lot of what modern Western thinkers do than much else of what is going on in the early Chinese intellectual landscape. And so, yeah, the Mohists drove a conversation that was very verbal, very chatty, very argumentative. They have the only systematic logic works that we have preserved from early China. Works on Bian, that's the word they use. And the Zhuangzi tradition, the Taoist tradition in general, I think, I mean, it starts from dismay on many levels. It starts from dismay at coercive politics, and it starts from dismay at what we could call logocentrism. Now, the Taoist texts themselves, quite famously, are literarily brilliant compositions. I mean, it's not like they have any allergy to using language. They're extremely adept and creative at using language. But the thing that they're quite committed to is that language does not express Tao. That word I tried to avoid using. In order to boil down a complicated, controversial conversation into a little soundbite, when they say that language doesn't capture Tao, I think they mean something like language does not capture, and it certainly cannot explain how it is that people do things. How it is that people do things is very much an ongoing, non-verbal question. And how it is that they do things is what produces linguistic performances. Rather than, I mean, also linguistic performances can stimulate people to do things in certain ways, but only in a way that is causally quite limited. That's a big conversation in and of itself. I feel like I'm going all over the place. Am I touching on something you found interesting?
It's all very interesting, Stephen.
Okay.
So thank you.
Thank you.
Stephen, I was wondering if I could get you to follow up a little bit further and tell us more about how the concept of harmony gets expanded in other parts. I was really struck by what you said about the contrast between harmony and agreement coming from Confucius all the way through. And I was wondering if you could just, like, for somebody like me who doesn't know very much about the tradition, give us a little more, situated a little bit more in terms of what the role of harmony is more generally, and what the role of where harmony comes up outside of this particular brick in the Zhuangzi.
Egad. All right.
Just a little bit to bring me a little bit further into that, because I found that the metaphor so alluring.
So, having perhaps run out of utility with the music metaphor, I'm going to use another metaphor that they use to sort of trigger different intuitions. So one of the classic passages about harmony is about making dinner. It's in a history book. I actually have never read this book, so I can't say much about its context. But basically, the guy says that creating social harmony is exactly like making soup. And what he says is, like, all of these ingredients are completely different from each other. And if you get the proportion wrong, the soup tastes bad. The expert cook knows exactly what proportions to use. So if that's kind of an intuition pump for us, in addition to music, I think the idea would be something like a disharmonious social situation and a disharmonious personal constitution is just obviously bad. Bad in like a pre-moral sense. It's painful, it's debilitating, it's inconvenient for yourself and others. Nobody wants to live either internally or externally in a world that is sort of disordered, out of proportion, and so on. And so the ongoing project of making things harmonious is something that a lot of classical Chinese thinkers agree is of paramount importance. Mohists being noteworthy exceptions. They would prefer that people be right. But yeah, both Confucian and Taoist texts strongly emphasize the idea that, like, interpersonal intelligence is very much a kind of scenario by scenario by scenario project. where what a person is learning to do with various tools, like Zhuangists don't really care about ritual and politeness, but Confucians, for instance, care tremendously about ritual and politeness, like using any tools available to sort of metaphorically blend people in a way that yields a pleasing product. Pleasing to everybody in it. I mean, no particular point of view is being privileged. Because like if you're listening to 3 instruments or just like a string quartet with 4 distinct instruments that sound really good together, it doesn't sound really good in a way that is against the interests or identities of any of those instruments. But I'm struggling to make the point I'm trying to make. I think a lot of times people associate the concept of harmony or the ideal of harmony with suppression of individuality or with subordinating individual interests to some kind of overall group gestalt in a way that's troubling. Obviously, one has to acknowledge the risk. I'm not sure that the Chinese guys didn't acknowledge it back in the day. It's not their objective. I mean, I say a little bit about this in the written version of the paper. So if things are as they're taken to be, that includes how you take them to be, just as much as it includes how anybody else takes them to be. It's not so much that nobody is right in the Zhuangs as that everybody is right intrinsically. The fact that they're right intrinsically means that everybody is wrong extrinsically and right intrinsically is one way of putting this. Reference to outside points of view renders everybody wrong. It's considered to be trivially so. Harmony is just going to, like, if I'm part of a harmonious situation, then I'm genuinely part of it, meaning I'm not in pain, ideally. I'm not being suppressed, but I am singing out in my distinctive way. How's that for a first reply?
That's a little bit helpful, yeah. It gives me some perspective on how important the concept is.
Cool.
Nutrition, yeah. We've got a few more minutes if anybody else has a question. And if not, we're going to set you free, Stephen. I want to thank you so much for the talk.
Cool. Thank you all. I'll stop my screen share.
And thanks to everybody for participating. I hope you didn't feel like it was too much time in front of a screen on a beautiful summer day. But I hope we can get you back tomorrow, and looking forward to it. Thanks, everybody.